Joining us now is Senator Brandon Creighton. He is the Republican author of the two major education bills in this third special session. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I just want to start off with where we're at. Of course, one of the main calls of this legislative special session is to pass a version of an education savings account, which was the governor's request. You already filed one of those bills, but notably you filed a separate one that is an omnibus funding bill for public schools. Talk about why those two were separate, since there were efforts during the regular session to combine those.
Yes, I appreciate that. We had a full hearing this week separately in Senate Finance in the Budget Writing Committee on the school finance bill that includes funding for public schools and also historic pay increases for our Texas teachers. And then yesterday in the Senate Education Committee that I chair, we had a full hearing on the school choice bill, which is the governor's emergency item, and unfinished business from the regular session. So during the regular session, the Senate spent 90% of the regular session keeping these issues separate, right? We had school funding in the budget, we had teacher pay in its own bill with teacher rights, and we had a school choice initiative. The House rejected those issues separately, so at the very end of the May regular session, we had one bill remaining that we poured all issues into and sent it over. We're back to the original plan now.
Gotcha. Now, we know that it has been more difficult in terms of passing the education savings account on the House side. If the House doesn't take up Senate Bill 1, which is the school choice school voucher bill, would the Senate use Senate Bill 2 as a vehicle, the education omnibus bill funding one? Would they use that as a vehicle to try to get the House to pass Senate Bill 1?
Well, we're working more optimistic on our goals for not only passing school choice, but the assumptions are that the House would be working on their measure and what they would like to see come together for the subject regarding school choice and education freedom, and we're doing the same. If we get into a tough situation at the end of the 30-day regular session where for some reason a bill has not moved, then we'll have to make decisions. But right now our intent is to keep these subjects separate.
And it can't be one without the other in the mind of lawmakers, because the ESAs was the governor's priority, right? Is that what your thinking is?
Well, yes, the education savings account, that is an emergency item for Texas as established by the governor. It was separate from the 10,000 bills we considered in the regular session. It was one of the few bills that we could take up in the first 60 days of the regular session that started in January. So because that is not yet finished and accomplished, we're back again after the tax specials to address this issue along with school funding, along with teacher pay, and all of the historic new funds that we're putting into public schools.
Do you feel confident, even though it wasn't on his list, that the governor would approve a school funding teacher pay raises bill as proposed by the Senate and hopefully agreed upon by the House?
I think all of these issues are very important. Public schools have passed budgets, and they're expecting for the school funding bill to pass and for us to take care of that part of what they base their budgeting off of for the year. So I would expect that we would accomplish all three. Of course, we have to base our sequencing and our goals on what's established as an emergency item. So I would expect school choice would be the top priority until we get that accomplished and set aside.
I do want to pivot. You have been hesitant and made a point during the Senate Education Committee to avoid the word vouchers and make a clear distinction between that. Republicans have definitely, I think, avoided the word vouchers in general. So what exactly is the difference between an education savings account plan and a school voucher?
Yes, in describing the difference between voucher and education savings account, I'm not as much doing that for political reasons. I'm making sure that the public that's watching that may have specific concerns about dollars transferring directly to a family where it could be misused or not spent wisely or not spent on the appropriate education materials. That's not what we're doing here. That's a voucher. What we're doing here is working towards an education savings account where the comptroller's office, not the Texas Education Agency, would build a framework, would manage these accounts, and the provider, the education provider, the private school, for instance, would receive the funding direct. So we have the strongest anti-fraud provisions in the country. We have a framework that I believe is the best model out of the other 31 states in America that have expanded school choice. And the difference between the two is important to note for the public that's watching, so they can distinguish between what potentially could be misused and what has a framework that would protect the public trust on the use of these dollars.
Comparatively speaking, I'm sure you've spent a lot of time looking at other states' models and as a comparison for your framework. What specifically does Texas have in the bill as proposed that would prevent fraud in how the public uses these dollars for going to private school or charter school, sending their child? Because that was something that also came up during committee hearing, of concerns of making sure that these fundings are used for their intent.
Sure, it's a great question. There are specific and rigid audit provisions. Again, it's an education savings account, so the account and the $8,000 that's approved for the limited number of students in Texas that would even be able to use one of these, those funds would distribute to an approved and accredited private school instead of being distributed direct to the family for them to make decisions on how they want to spend the money. So there are audit provisions, and there's a strict framework where the funding itself would go directly to the school.
Another thing that came up during committee was concerns about accountability, since private schools are not beholden to the same standards as public schools. So if a private school or charter school were to benefit from the ESAs, how can the state ensure that they're effectively educating Texas children to the same standards you would have in public schools?
Well, as you know, private schools rely on norm reference testing. That is, long-standing accountability for the testing process and what universities rely on as private school students apply for the next level of education at the higher education level has worked wonderfully for years, and we expect it to continue to. We believe that mom and dads, and families will hold private schools accountable as they've held public schools accountable, right? If a mom or a dad or a guardian is not pleased with outcomes in a public school and they're moving their child from public to private, that means that they're paying close attention to outcomes and results. We don't have any reason to believe they wouldn't continue to do the same. We'll also have results that we will monitor based on those kids and how they do in the private school setting. But at the end of the day, we're relying on families, not institutions, to grade papers on what's best for their children's education.
It was interesting. There was a Republican woman who testified the other day and said, I am against this bill. And she cited concern that once the private schools are getting money from the state, that they might have to change their standards in a way that some of those parents might not want to see. Is that a valid concern under the bill as proposed?
Yes, and I mean, it's interesting that she was Republican, but only in the sense that all walks of life support school choice, right? I mean, I think it was 88% support as a proposition in the primary in the last election. 77% of families across the state support it. Over 50% of Democrats support it. So the partisan side of it didn't stand out as much. But yes, there are always concerns brought forward in committee. That was one of them. And we just continued to listen to the witnesses one by one as they voice concerns. But I think the bill has an incredible framework that will protect and safeguard the public and the use of the dollars.
Let's talk about cost. This is going to cost the state about $500 million for each 2-year cycle. Right. Do you see that as something that will be sustainable coming out of what we had as a record budget surplus year in the years to come for Texas?
I do, and that's why we have the program exactly where it is, with $500 million dedicated, completely separate from public school funding. We have historic funds going in to public schools, not only matching the last 2-year budget for public schools, but The new money going into public schools is approaching $9 billion, which is the entire state budget for 11 states in America. Not just the new money, not the entire budget for education, but just the new dollars that we're dedicating. So we have a tremendous lift for public schools and public school teachers. This $500 million, like the border, like the grid, healthcare, CPS, highways, transportation, water, it's a separate funding initiative that does not go through the Texas Education Agency.
We do always hear from people, and this was also brought up in committee, of, well, it could go to XYZ. This is money that could go to other things. We
Yes.
have so many issues, a very large budget.
Yes.
Talk about the process of how that is decided, of whether or not this would be better spent in other areas like border security or more towards education. Is that a valid argument, I guess?
Yes, I mean, so we had a surplus coming into the session of over $30 billion, and there were advocates in the Capitol that wanted $30 billion of the surplus, 100% of it, to go to public education. We've spent 40 years trying to get the state share of public education up to 50%. That has always been a key objection to school choice by public school advocates. Well, we're here now. We've had 40 years of objections to school choice because the state has been in litigation over funding schools properly. And until that litigation was settled, school choice could not be on the table. We have no current litigation involving school funding. So with school funding not being in litigation and the state share of public ed being at 50% for the first time in over 40 years, it's more than an appropriate time with the available surplus dollars to, separately from funding public schools, allow moms and dads and kids with special needs in certain situations to have a fighting chance at a successful education going forward. And I, for one, support that.
Based off of how we saw this play out in the Senate versus House during the regular session, do you have any compromises you've thought up already for if the House doesn't come to the table with exactly, a pretty much similar version to Senate Bill 1?
I'm always thinking about compromise and negotiations, right? Compromise has become a bad word in politics these days, but as a synonym to that, we're always negotiating, and we're always trying to figure out, what is a deal point that would be acceptable to both chambers to make this make sense, but also not give on our principles or on the basic framework that will help kids succeed. I'm ready and eager to be at the table, to be working out those final details, and I'm encouraged and optimistic about my friends and colleagues in the House to be able to get there.
I've heard from some House Republicans who are talking about what might get those rural members on board, because
Yes.
what we heard from them is, well, this doesn't really apply to my constituents. They're happy with their public schools. We don't have many options. One option I heard was because this has been rooted in, parents who have children at schools that might not be performing well, D-rated schools, F-rated schools. Right. Is there an option where this program would apply to people who are in failing schools can use it to go somewhere else? Anything like that?
Well, if our friends in rural Texas, and I have a district that also has rural counties as well, but if our friends in rural Texas have concerns that there aren't options available to use these ESAs, well, conversely, the ESAs would not be used because those options aren't available, right? So there shouldn't be much concern that there's any impact on the public schools, as we're seeing in rural areas across the nation for states that have approved school choice. There isn't a lot of use of these ESAs, but as our friends in rural areas also vote outside their district for the future of this state and the success of Texas going forward, for the border, for the electric grid, for healthcare initiatives that affect larger metropolitan areas, and many other types of issues that aren't specific to their district, but those inherent problems for the state as a whole could one day affect their district in an incredibly negative way. We all want to unite together to help these kids no matter where they live in Texas.
Lastly, I do want to ask you about some overall tensions between the leaders of the upper and lower chamber that have been Certainly interesting to watch unfold. I mean, do you have concerns about the ability to strike a deal with tensions high between Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Speaker of the House Dade Phelan? Do you agree with Patrick's calls for Phelan to resign?
You know, years ago I worked on staff when Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock was in office and Governor Ann Richards was the governor, and I saw arguments between them that would make sailors blush and that would just absolutely diminish any squabble between the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker today as just a slight disagreement. So the public doesn't expect us to rubber stamp all of these very difficult issues, and in fact when you're dealing with people's money and you're passing or considering policies that have an effect on their children and their daily lives, their businesses, and their communities, it's very difficult to work through all of that. So I think between the House and Senate members, there are much better relationships than is reported. Chairman Brad Buckley and I, both working as counterparts in education, couldn't have a stronger relationship. That is not rare in the Capitol. We're working through tough issues. The statewide will do as well, and we'll produce something that is strong for Texas. And at the end of the day, we'll get the policy and the dollar straight in a way that serves these kids the best.
So I take you don't think Speaker Phelan should resign?
You know, I'm not weighing in on House business because I've got my plate full on the Senate side. I think the House members will make the best decisions for the House, and I love the House. I served in the House for 8 years. I even was sworn into the Senate in the House chamber because I enjoyed my time in the House so much. But I'm going to let them take care of their own business, and I've got plenty of mine to deal with as well.
It sounds like you already have discussions with other House members of how to move forward with ESAs despite some of these tensions with leaders.
I'm in communications constant with House members and House leaders on these education issues. I will not let any disagreements in my public service affect the kids of Texas, and we're gonna get to the finish line with something that is not only appropriate but is a national model for the kids of this state and other kids across the nation to follow.
All right, Senator Brandon Creighton,
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.